Frustration at work is perfectly normal. It's a normal part of work life. It can be challenging to deal with. That's why today we're going to talk about how to become more resilient to the frustration you do experience at work, and then how do you show up as your better self. This is the Practicing Leader podcast. I'm your host, Prul Bhargava, and let's discuss. Last week, I had the opportunity to go speak to another team about frustration at work. One of the great questions that came up is how do you remain resilient to all of this, which is the impetus behind this podcast. One of the first points I made was it's important to accept and recognize that you are experiencing emotions and that it is happening. When you're feeling those emotions and feeling the frustration, you need to acknowledge and accept it. If you don't do that, there is no way for you to be able to make an informed decision or even be an intentional decision about how are you going to handle that frustration. When you allow frustration to drive your behavior, you have a higher chance of you actually listening to respond versus listening to hear. Make sure that you don't deny or suppress those emotions or suppress that frustration, but instead figure out how do you manage through that and figure that out. One of the things that I do when I find myself in a frustrating situation is to effectively just stop, drop, and roll. Take a moment, take a break, and step away from the situation if you need to. This will also give you some time and some space to be able to think about the problem from a fresh perspective. This can mean taking a walk. This can mean taking just a quick 5-10 minute hiatus. This can mean anything in between. This is where you need to give yourself space to be able to think about, are you trying to be right or trying to do right? Because really that's the question you need to be answering for yourself is your frustration stemming from a wrong decision being made or a decision that you didn't necessarily like, and be able to distinguish between the two? When faced with a frustrating situation, the piece of advice I can provide is to focus on those things that you're able to control. For example, if a project is not going well, rather than focusing on the fact that it's not, instead focus on the steps it would take to make progress or bring it back on track. We'll think about what is your next action. Be mindful of what you're going through. If you're experiencing frustration, chances are you're either becoming angry, becoming irritated, becoming something that you don't necessarily want to exhibit to your coworkers or to anybody else. Just like you don't want to experience that from someone else, you don't want to inflict that on others. Be mindful and be as calm as you feasibly can, even in these frustrating situations. If required, take a moment to breathe, think about how you're going to respond, and be as kind as you feasibly can be when you're trying to respond to somebody. We only have a limited perspective into a person's life. We see them through a keyhole. We see them through that, and we only see a small subset of what's going on, because in reality, there's so much going on in a person's life, which you may not necessarily see. Being kind and thoughtful with your time as well as how you respond, so that way you don't inflict on somebody else whatever it is that you're going through, or especially be able to give them grace in case they're going through something. Nobody shows up to work with the intent to do a poor job. Everyone is trying to do the best job that they can. And finally, don't be afraid to seek support, whether it be from friends, from colleagues, family. If you need help because you're feeling overwhelmed, take a moment to ask for that help. Asking for help is not a sign of weakness. In actuality, it's a sign of strength. Taking the time to make those requests and to ask for that help will at least put you in a better position to be able to solve the problem or try to overcome the frustration you might be experiencing. During last week's session where I met with another team, one of the questions that came up was, how do you deal with the constant stretching that's being asked of you, and you're constantly being stretched to the extreme? How do you remain resilient even in that? And the guidance I provided was, take the time to know what your limits are, have the conversation with your manager, have the conversation with your colleagues, figure out, is there a path by which you can try to reduce the frustration, but understand that there is some constant stretching that will occur. And you have to know your limits and know your boundaries. Remember, building resilience to frustration takes both time and patience. By incorporating these strategies into your daily routine, you have a higher chance of being able to handle frustration when it does arise and be able to cope with it as you're going through it in the moment. This will allow you to be more resilient to frustration at work, as well as being more effective at dealing with frustration when it does arise. This has been the Practicing Leader podcast. I'm your host, Pearl Vargava, and I'll see you next week.